Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime. Welcome back to the channel. In part 2 of the true tale of Lizzie Borden, we dive into one of the most sensational trials in American history. After the brutal 1892 axe murder of Andrew and Abby Borden, Lizzie Borden stood accused, and the nation couldn't look away. In this episode, we take you inside the courtroom as the trial unfolds, the drama, the press frenzy, and the high-stakes legal battle as Lizzie fights to escape the hangman's noose. If you missed part 1, click on the link below to watch the beginning of this fascinating story. Before we get started, please like, comment, and especially subscribe to help others find the channel and help us reach 20,000 subscribers. This is the true tale of Lizzie Borden, part 2, the trial of the century. The gruesome axe murders of Andrew and Abby Borden were so shocking that Fall River citizens began to speculate that Jack the Ripper had come to town. The murders attributed to the fiend who butchered at least 5 women in East London had occurred only 4 years earlier and were still unsolved. That horror was still fresh on people's minds even thousands of miles across the ocean in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So citizens were shocked when one of their respected neighbors and the daughter of one of the victims was arrested and booked into the Taunton jail on charges of double murder. Oddly, Lizzie Borden, the accused, didn't appear surprised. When informed she was being arrested, she remarked, "I knew it was coming." Lizzie, the daughter of a well-to-do Fall River businessman, was not treated as the other women housed in the women's ward of the Taunton jail. She was fortunate in that the jail matron was Mrs. Andrew Wright, wife of the town sheriff and the mother of one of Lizzie's childhood friends. Like most of Lizzie's acquaintances, Mrs. Wright was sure that Lizzie's arrest was a gross miscarriage of justice. She worked to make Lizzie's environment as pleasant as possible under the circumstances. Her cell was 9 feet by 7 feet and contained only a bed, chair, and a wash bowl. Mrs. Wright provided the prisoner with a softer pillow, warm blankets, and reading materials. Lizzie was forbidden from reading the daily newspapers. Still, she was allowed visitors, including her sister, minister, and attorneys, who kept her abreast of what was being said in town about her case. Lizzie was also allowed to order meals from the hotel restaurant, instead of the usual jailhouse fare provided to the other inmates. While she waited for the trial to begin, the police built their case. Learning of the tension in the Borden home, due to Lizzie and Emma's anger over a property issue, investigators searched for Andrew Borden's will. They even cracked open his office safe. Inside, they found insurance policies, property deeds, and a large amount of cash, but no will. It was determined that both Andrew and Abby Borden had died without having drafted one, which was somewhat odd, as Borden was a man of means who owned several properties. Still, police theorized that financial gain was the most likely motive for the murders. According to the tax assessor reports, Andrew Borden owned real estate worth $173,000, equivalent to approximately $6 million today. He also owned personal property appraised at an additional $30,000, or about $1 million in today's dollars. Abby Borden had money of her own, approximately $5,000, or $175,000 today. This was most likely inherited from her father's estate. However, Lizzie and Emma also owned personal property worth approximately $10,000, or $350,000 each. These assets were primarily stocks and bonds. And here's an interesting fact I discovered. Since investigators determined that Abby Borden died before her husband, any assets that belonged to her would have immediately become the property of her surviving spouse. Andrew Borden died 90 minutes after his wife, automatically making him her heir. This suggests that after Borden's death, his children, Lizzie and Emma, became the de facto heirs to Abby's property and assets, as well as their father's. Beginning November 15th, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence against Lizzie Borden to determine if there was enough to bring the case to trial. Lizzie's friend and neighbor Alice Russell was called to testify. Alice shared a detail that caused all of Fall River to buzz with new interest in the already riveting case. Alice said that 3 days after the murder, she witnessed Lizzie burn a dress in the kitchen stove. Lizzie had remarked that the dress was stained with paint. It was investigators' belief that Lizzie had destroyed evidence, namely the blood-stained dress she'd worn while committing the murders. But others were reminded that police had searched the house just after the murders. How had they not discovered a bloody dress? If you'll recall, I mentioned in part 1 that the officers conducting the search believed it was inappropriate to go through a woman's things. They certainly didn't want to be impolite by rifling through drawers and bureaus that may contain a woman's delicates. It was later revealed that police searched Lizzie's closet where some dresses were hanging, but most likely hadn't thoroughly searched through her bureau drawers. In truth, if there had been a bloody dress, it may have been hidden anywhere in the house and may have been missed during a search. Lizzie had occupied the home for nearly 20 years and would have known every nook and cranny where an item could be secreted away. On December 2, 1892, the grand jury, consisting of 23 men, indicted Lizzie Borden for the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton reported to Attorney General Albert Pillsbury that the vote to indict had been, quote, substantial but not unanimous. The prosecution knew they were facing an uphill battle to try a woman of Lizzie Borden's standing and reputation for such a brutal crime. However, they felt they had no choice but to do so. Everything they'd learned during their investigation pointed to Lizzie. She would benefit financially from her parents' deaths. She had attempted to buy poison the day before the murders. Other than the housemaid who had been cleared of any wrongdoing, Lizzie was the only other person in the home when the crime occurred. Lizzie had lied about her stepmother receiving a note and going out that morning. This was most likely to ensure that her father didn't look for his wife upon his return home, who already lay dead upstairs. And Lizzie had changed her story repeatedly regarding her movements and actions on the morning of the murders. Even though she was their most likely suspect, it appeared that the prosecutors were still looking for a rationale for the murders. They consulted with an expert to assess Lizzie's mental state. They wanted to know if Lizzie Borden was insane. However, her attorneys would not allow a doctor to examine their client, stating that to do so would suggest that they believed her guilty. Instead, investigators were limited to searching the Borden family history for any hint of mental illness, to perhaps uncover clues as to Lizzie's mental state. Witnesses shared with investigators that Lizzie Borden's biological mother, Sarah, had been, quote, a peculiar woman with a very bad temper. They were also told that the family had always been odd. One neighbor stated, quote, we never heard that any one of them was insane, but I think some of them are worse than insane. Lizzie was generally described as a woman of bad disposition. One alarming rumor about Lizzie had been floating around Fall River for some time. The story was that Lizzie, angry that her stepmother's kitten had scratched her, took the poor animal to the chopping block and cut its head off. The Borden's milkman would state that he knew for a fact that this had happened. However, it was a rumor that investigators couldn't definitively corroborate as true. In the end, the issue of sanity would not be allowed into the trial. Andrew Jennings, Lizzie's attorney, stated in no uncertain terms that his client was innocent and would not even consider pleading guilty by reason of insanity. He told reporters that he and Lizzie looked forward to bringing their case before a jury he was sure would exonerate his client. Lizzie Borden's trial began on Monday, June 5, 1893. She'd been locked behind bars in Taunton for nearly a year. Due to the intense media coverage of the case, it was decided that the trial would be held in New Bedford, about 15 miles east of Fall River. Large crowds showed up early in the morning, hoping to secure a seat in the courtroom to watch the day's proceedings. This started on the very first day of the trial, although that day merely involved impaneling the jury and watching them receive instructions from the judge. According to that evening's newspaper reports, the public's first sighting of Lizzie Borden as she arrived to court was a letdown. Lizzie wore a black wool dress trimmed with purple velvet at the cuffs and hem. A new black lace hat adorned with blue rosettes and a blue feather sat atop her head. Her hands were clad in black gloves. One journalist said Miss Borden was, quote, a plain-looking old maid. Another, even more insulting writer stated that she was, quote, plain to the point of homeliness. Lizzie's booking description would describe her as 5 foot 4 inches tall, with a light complexion and gray eyes. Her weight was not stated in the arrest record, but one reporter observed that, quote, the lower part of her countenance was greatly overweighted, end quote. Another, perhaps trying to be more kind, stated that Lizzie had beautiful fine nut brown hair and was neither large nor small, tall nor short, but of average build. One description of Lizzie that would remain consistent was that she remained calm, stoic, and unflappable almost without fail. Lizzie Borden would betray little emotion throughout the 13-day trial. There were only rare cracks in her otherwise stone-faced demeanor. Lizzie's defense team consisted of her longtime friend and family attorney, Andrew Jennings from Fall River, who was assisted by Boston attorneys Melvin O. Adams and George D. Robinson. Jennings, who was not a criminal defense attorney and had no capital case experience, enlisted these top-notch attorneys to join the team. Robinson had over 20 years of courtroom experience and had served 3 one-year terms as governor of Massachusetts. As was standard procedure in capital cases heard in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts at that time, 3 Superior Court judges would preside over the hearings: Chief Justice Albert Mason and Associate Justices Caleb Blodgett and Justin Dewey. Chief Justice Mason had been appointed to the bench by Governor Robinson, who now served as Lizzie's co-counsel. The prosecution team included District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, who'd serve as lead counsel, and District Attorney William H. Moody. To counteract the intense local media coverage, the jury pool consisted of residents outside of Bristol County. 12 men were chosen and impaneled to sit on the jury during the first day's proceedings. Women would not be allowed by law to serve as jurors until 1950, and the first women would not be impaneled in Massachusetts until 1951. The judge gave the jury its instructions and informed them that they would be sequestered for the length of the trial. Afterward, they were allowed to contact their families and employers to inform them they'd be away for an extended period. They were then taken to the Parker House Hotel and given rooms. They would be paid $3 per day for their service, plus their meals. Lizzie Borden was transferred to the New Bedford Central Jail, where she would remain until the end of the trial. On Tuesday, June 6th, D.A. William Moody gave his opening statement, laying out the Commonwealth's case against Lizzie Borden. He began by saying, quote, upon the 4th day of August of the last year, an old man and woman, each without a known enemy in the world, in their own home, upon a frequented street in the most populous city in this county, under the light of day and in the midst of its activities, were killed by unlawful human agency. Today, a woman of good social position, of hitherto unquestioned character, a daughter of one of the victims, is at the bar of this court, accused of these crimes, end quote. He described Mr. Borden as a man of considerable property who chose to live upon a narrow scale. He spoke of the defendant's dissatisfaction with her living conditions, her animosity towards her stepmother, and by association with her father. He provided the timeline leading up to the murders, how the Bordens had experienced what was described as food poisoning, but her stepmother suspected they'd been deliberately poisoned. He also told the jury how Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid, a very deadly poison, the day before the murders, and that she'd made ominous comments to a friend the night before the murders, in which she claimed she feared for her father's safety and predicted, quote, someone will do something. He then described the layout of the Borden home, emphasizing the close proximity the family was forced to live in, with one room opening into another. He also spoke of how the family locked both their exterior and interior doors with keys several times a day. Moody wanted the jury to understand, from his point of view, that no one, save Lizzie Borden, could have been inside the home at the time the axe murders were committed. He then took the jurors through a timeline of the day of the murders, tracing each occupant's movements inside and outside the house. Finally, he produced what he said was the possible murder weapon, a hatchet broken off at the base of its wood handle. This was the most dramatic portion of the prosecutor's opening statement, until it was quickly eclipsed by a startling demonstration. Moody pulled open a black bag and silently revealed the broken skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden. This message is sponsored by Greenlight. Who taught you about money? Your parents? School? Let's be honest, most of us learned to save and budget way later than we should have. But here's the good news. Your kids don't have to wait. With Greenlight, they can get a head start. Greenlight is a debit card and money app made just for families. Parents can send money to their kids, track their spending, and even set up savings goals. And kids? They learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely in a fun way. We're talking games, goals, and real-life lessons. And yes, there's even a chores feature. Parents can set up custom tasks for their kids, pay them an allowance, and teach responsibility all in one go. After I learned about Greenlight, I told my daughter we needed to start using it for the grandkids. And once I showed her the Greenlight app, she agreed. Now we just wish we'd started even sooner. It's been a real game changer. Greenlight is the easy, convenient way to raise financially smart kids and navigate life together as a family. No wonder millions of parents are already on board. So what are you waiting for? Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/once. That's greenlight.com/once to get started. greenlight.com/once. Are you thinking about trying Ozempic, Wegovy, or other GLP-1 medications, but the price tag or hassle is holding you back? You're not alone. But now there's a smarter way. Meet Zelthy. Zelthy is a 100% online service that makes access to GLP-1 medications simple and affordable. If you qualify, their licensed prescribers can get you medications like Ozempic, Wegovy, semaglutide, or tirzepatide for 80 to 90% less than traditional prices. That's right, no waiting rooms, no pharmacy lines, everything is delivered right to your door. It's never been easier or more affordable to get started. Just send a quick text. Text once to 200-300 and see if you qualify today. Don't wait. Text right now for a link to your exclusive offer. Text the word once to 200-300. That's once to 200-300. Once to 200-300. Zelthy. Affordable care delivered. Texting privacy policy and terms and conditions posted at textplans.us. Texting enrolls for recurring automated text marketing messages. Message and data rates may apply. Reply STOP to opt out. Consult a doctor prior to use. Lizzie, who up until this time had sat attentive yet stoic, swooned in her seat. The court reacted with a gasp as her attorney quickly grasped her arm to keep her from falling out of her seat. Lizzie's minister, Reverend William Walker Jubb, who'd been at her side since the murders were discovered, ran to her aid and administered smelling salts. She quickly regained her composure, and the trial resumed. This was the type of drama the public came to see. Finally, Lizzie Borden's humanity showed through her icy veneer. While some expressed sympathy for Lizzie, others, more cynical, wondered if her fainting spell might have been caused primarily by the humidity and unbearable heat inside the courtroom, more than the macabre display. After lunch, the jurors were escorted to the train station, where they boarded the afternoon train to Fall River for a tour of the Borden house. Once there, they studied both the interior and exterior of the house and walked through the neighborhood. They visited the paint store where the first call to the police to report the murders was made. They also went to Andrew Borden's office building and the drugstore where it was alleged that Lizzie had attempted to purchase poison. The following day, the prosecution began calling their witnesses. John Morse, the Borden's house guest, provided the timeline of the morning of the murders until 8:40 a.m., when after having breakfast with Mr. and Mrs. Borden, he left to visit relatives on the other side of town. Other witnesses were called to establish Andrew Borden's movements that morning after he left for his office. But that day's star witness was Bridget Sullivan, the Borden's 26-year-old live-in housemaid. She described the odd habit that the Bordens had of repeatedly locking and unlocking doors both outside and inside the house using keys. She also testified that after Mrs. Borden asked her to wash the windows, Lizzie went outside to tell her she needn't lock the door. Bridget, who started washing the outside of the windows first, said that the chore required her to walk out to the barn several times to fill her bucket with water. Bridget had just come back inside to wash the interior windows when Mr. Borden returned. She testified that the front door had been locked and remembered she'd had trouble opening it to let Mr. Borden in. She described seeing Lizzie on the landing as Mr. Borden entered. Lizzie would have been positioned in direct sightline of Mrs. Borden, who by that time lay dead on the floor in the guest room, the prosecutor established. Bridget recalled that Lizzie had greeted her father and asked if there was any mail. She heard her tell Mr. Borden that Mrs. Borden had received a note about a sick friend and had left the house to call on her. A short time later, Mr. Borden went into the sitting room. Lizzie, in the dining room ironing handkerchiefs, asked Bridget if she would be going out that afternoon. She told Bridget if she did go out, she should lock the door. "Mrs. Borden has gone out on a sick call," she said, "and I might go out too." A few minutes later, Lizzie went into the kitchen where Bridget was working and told her there was a, quote, cheap sale of dress goods at Sargent's at 8 cents a yard. Bridget commented that it was indeed a good deal. Sargent's department store was a 10-minute walk from the house. Bridget responded that she was still feeling ill. She'd been nauseous in the morning and was too hot and tired from washing the windows to go shopping and wanted to take a nap. Then Bridget had gone to her room on the 3rd floor to lie down. She said she was woken up by Lizzie's cries a short time later. "Father's dead. Someone's come in and killed him." Bridget had later asked Lizzie where she had been when Mr. Borden was killed. She answered that she'd been out in the backyard and had, quote, heard a groan, returned inside, and found her father's body. On cross-examination, Mr. Robinson drilled Bridget on the details of her testimony. He asked which doors had been locked or unlocked, how she was sure they were locked, etc. He tried to lay a foundation to suggest an unseen intruder was the killer. But Bridget had repeated nearly the exact same details since she was first questioned by police. Now her testimony under rigorous cross by Lizzie's attorney remained unshakable. Robinson did score a few points, however, when he asked Bridget to describe Lizzie's appearance so soon after the murders. Did she observe any blood on Lizzie or her clothing? Was her hair disheveled? No, Bridget had to admit. On redirect, the prosecutor asked Bridget to remind the jury about her testimony regarding Lizzie's clothing that day. Bridget had testified that Lizzie was wearing a dark blue dress on the morning of the murders, but had changed into a pink wrapper in the afternoon. A wrapper is a more informal garment like a robe or dressing gown, not worn outside the house or if receiving company. Other witnesses recalled Lizzie wearing the pink wrapper when they arrived at the crime scene. It was clear that Lizzie had changed into clothing different from what she had been wearing in the morning. However, this would not have been seen as unusual. Victorian women changed their clothing up to 5 times per day, depending on their activities, such as being at home, visiting others, shopping in town, receiving guests, etc. However, it seems somewhat odd that she changed into such an informal item of clothing after she knew the police would be arriving, and she would surely have to meet with them. Witnesses were next called to testify about what they'd observed after the murders were discovered. Dr. Seabury Bowen took the stand first. Dr. Bowen was the Borden's neighbor and their family physician. Lizzie had sent Bridget to fetch the doctor immediately after informing her that Mr. Borden had been killed. He described finding Andrew Borden's body downstairs, and then after being summoned upstairs by Mrs. Churchill, discovering Abby murdered as well. Dr. Bowen said he'd asked Lizzie if she'd seen anyone enter the house that day. She'd answered that she'd been in the barn looking for irons. Lizzie had told investigators at the inquest that she'd gone out to the barn to find iron to use as fishing sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip. Dr. Bowen was questioned about what he recalled Lizzie wearing. He was less clear about the details of her clothing. Reporters explained that this was likely because he was a man and didn't notice such things. Bridget Sullivan was recalled to the stand to reiterate the details about Lizzie's change of clothing from the morning to the afternoon. On cross, Dr. Bowen was asked if he'd given Lizzie anything for her nerves after the murders. He said he had given her an effervescent for headaches, and the following day, he'd added 1/8 of a grain of sulfate of morphine to help her sleep. This would be equivalent to 8 milligrams of morphine. The following day, he doubled the dosage. In his questioning of Dr. Bowen, Lizzie's attorney Melvin Adams established that Lizzie had continued to take the medication up until the inquest. He also testified that a quarter-grain dose of morphine could affect memory and cause hallucinations. Adams laid the foundation to explain and possibly have excluded Lizzie's disastrous inquest testimony. Her answers to the grand jury had placed her in the sight hairs of the police as their most likely suspect. Adelaide Churchill, Borden's neighbor and one of the first on the scene, was called as a witness and by all accounts relished being in the spotlight. She was known as a notorious curtain twitcher in the neighborhood, a nosy Nellie, if you will. She knew the comings and goings of everyone living on her block and was never shy about sharing what she observed. One reporter described Mrs. Churchill's appearance in court as follows, quote, "No Mayday queen was ever happier than Sister Churchill on the stand." After establishing that Mrs. Churchill had lived next door to the Bordens for years, the witness described watching Mr. Borden leave for work that morning. Mrs. Churchill said she had also left her house soon after to run errands. Upon her return, she noticed some excitement at the Bordens. She saw Bridget run across the street and then returned with Dr. Bowen. Mrs. Churchill had approached the Borden house and saw Lizzie standing just inside the side screen door. That's when Lizzie had said, quote, "Oh, Mrs. Churchill, do come in. Someone has murdered Father." Mrs. Churchill gave a detailed description of Lizzie's clothing, and on cross admitted that she'd seen no spots of blood on Lizzie's clothing or person. Alice Russell, Lizzie's friend, testified next. She told of Lizzie's visit to her home the night before the murders, and her friend sharing an ominous feeling that she had. Lizzie told her that Abby and her father suspected their milk had been poisoned. Alice had remarked how improbable this would be. How could someone tamper with the milk cartons without someone seeing them, she wondered out loud to her friend. Lizzie then pivoted this conversation, saying that she'd seen, quote, "a strange man lurking around the house." She also added that her father had a man angry with him because he would not rent him some property. The story continued, Alice said, with Lizzie describing how the barn had been broken into twice. Trying to ease her friend's worries, Alice offered the opinion that it was probably just boys trying to steal some pigeons. But Lizzie had continued, saying, quote, "I feel as if I want to sleep with my eyes half open, with one eye open half the time, for fear they will burn the house down over us," end quote. The following day, Bridget had come running to Alice Russell's house to report that Lizzie's parents had indeed been slain. The Sunday after the murders, Alice testified she was at the Borden's house when Lizzie walked into the kitchen and went to the stove. Emma, who was also in the kitchen, asked what Lizzie was doing, and her sister answered, quote, "I am going to burn this old dress. It is covered in paint." Later, when questioned about Lizzie's clothing, Alice reluctantly told police about the incident. She was then compelled to testify at the inquest, and after that time, Lizzie and Emma had turned their backs on her. She and Lizzie were no longer friends, Alice said sadly. On Robinson's cross-examination, he established that officers had already searched the house before the dress was burned. He attempted to convince the jury that Lizzie had not burned evidence of a crime, but was merely keeping herself busy with household tasks to keep her mind off the tragedy that had occurred. Officers testified to other details of that tragic day. Assistant Marshal John Fleet, who had found the hatchet suspected to be the murder weapon, testified about Lizzie's odd answer to his question about who may have killed her mother and father. "She is not my mother, sir," Lizzie had answered. "She is my stepmother." Lizzie also volunteered to the officer that a man had come to the door of the house at 9 a.m. that morning. After making this statement, she'd prompted Alice Russell to share what she'd told her friend the night before about the man who was angry with her father. Finally, Fleet testified that he'd attempted to search Lizzie's room on the day of the murders, but she'd shut herself inside with Dr. Bowen. When he asked to be let in, Lizzie had said no one could get into a room, so there was really no point in searching it. He'd done a very quick search anyway, hovered over by both Lizzie and Dr. Bowen, Fleet said. Testimony about the alleged murder weapon, the handleless hatchet as it was being called, was called into question, with one officer saying he saw the broken handle in the box of ashes. No one else recalled seeing the handle, which threw a monkey wrench into the prosecution's theory. The prosecution's theory was that after being used to kill the Bordens, the handle had been stained with blood. It was then broken off and burned to get rid of this evidence. The hatchet blade was then washed off and rubbed with ashes to eliminate any lingering blood evidence before being placed in the box in the cellar, where it was later found. If the handle had been in the box the whole time, the prosecution's theory held no water. Moody then sent an officer to search the cellar for the missing handle the next day, but although 2 other axes and a wooden hatchet were found, no handle was recovered. But the testimony of the previous day had jurors questioning whether the broken hatchet was the murder weapon after all. They could no longer be sure. Lizzie Borden's testimony during the inquest was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. She had contradicted her story about what she'd done, seen, and heard on the day of the murders. She told several versions about discovering her father's body, telling an officer that she'd been alerted upon hearing a scraping noise, and telling Bridget Sullivan she'd heard a groan. She said alternately that she'd been in the barn to find material to make a sinker, or that she'd been searching for tin to fix a screen. She'd later added the detail that she'd stopped on her way to the barn to pick pears off the tree, and then spent some time in the hot, sweltering barn nibbling on them while her father was inside being hacked to pieces. She'd added this portion of her story after the DA had pointed out that her errand to the barn couldn't have taken more than a few minutes. The prosecutor also pointed out portions of the inquest where it appeared that Lizzie was suggesting alternate suspects. She shared stories of 2 incidents where she saw strange men lurking near the house. Finally, the prosecution argued that her lie about Abby Borden receiving a note and leaving the house, and her explanation for burning the dress, all pointed towards her guilt. Lizzie's lawyer argued that her inquest testimony should be excluded. They contended that she had not been cautioned about her right not to testify, guaranteed by the Massachusetts Constitution. Robinson argued that his client had been duped into testifying against her own best interests, and because of this, her testimony was not admissible. D.A. Knowlton said Lizzie had voluntarily testified at the inquest, so her statements should be admitted as evidence. The judge asked Robinson to make his argument without the jury present. Robinson used all the sexist tropes of that time to state his case and have Lizzie's words thrown out. Robinson told the court that Lizzie Borden was a woman, which made her inherently susceptible to being easily confused, especially when under pressure. She was a defenseless woman who stood alone against the big bad prosecutor who had harangued, coerced, and pressured her. Quote, pushed, examined, cross-questioned, surrounded by hostile officials, Miss Borden was badgered and confused to such an extent that during those long 3 days of inquisition, she contradicted herself time and time again, end quote. He also said that Lizzie was, quote, in the hands of Mr. Knowlton, whose manner towards her led her to fear him and to shrink from him as perhaps any woman so placed would fear a powerful man whom she regarded as her enemy and her persecutor, end quote. After hearing the arguments for and against allowing the inquest testimony into the trial, Chief Justice Mason ruled that although Lizzie Borden had not been under arrest when her testimony was given, she was, quote, as effectually in custody as if the formal precept had been served. The judge implied that the investigators had strategically held off arresting Lizzie until after the inquest. He therefore ruled that Lizzie's statements were not voluntary and as such were inadmissible at trial. In a rare show of emotion, Lizzie cried with relief. The jury was then brought back into the courtroom. Medical experts were called to the stand next to attest to the wounds inflicted on the Bordens and their cause of death. Mr. Borden had received 10 wounds to the head from 2 to 4.5 inches long. The left side of his skull had been crushed. Mrs. Borden had received 18 wounds to the head from 0.5 inch to 5.5 inches in length. The right side of her skull had received the most damage. The doctor who performed the autopsy replied in the affirmative when asked whether a woman of normal strength using a hatchet could have inflicted the blows. While jurors began to grow weary or squeamish about the details of the bloody murders, Lizzie, reporters observed, reacted in an interesting and perhaps telling way. Quote, "Whenever the lawyers who oppose her come to the subject of bloodstains and the discussion of gory details of the murders, she hides her face in her hands. But when her own lawyers take up the same subjects, she keeps her head up and her eyes bright and tries not to miss a word of what is said. At first, it was thought that she could not endure the horrible topic, but enough time has passed to show that it depends upon who discusses it." End quote. Finally, in the last days of the trial, the issue of blood spatter was raised. The murders of both Andrew and Abby Borden were bloody in the extreme. How is it possible that if Lizzie was the killer, there was not a spot of blood on her? Dr. Dolan said the manner in which Mr. Borden had been killed suggested that his attacker had likely stood at the head of the sofa and, quote, rained blow after blow left and right. It was his opinion that the murder would have been spattered with blood on the upper part of the body and hands. However, another witness, Dr. Edward Wood, a professor of chemistry at Harvard Medical School, who'd been sent evidence in the Borden murder to analyze, including the victims' stomachs, testified that given the nature and position of the victims' wounds, quote, blood might spatter in any direction and might not spatter in every direction, end quote. It was his testimony that the killer may not have necessarily been covered with blood. It was a case of one expert witness canceling out the testimony of the other. So far, the case had been the prosecution's. The defense had yet to present its side beyond cross-examining witnesses. The prosecution had two more points to make: the tension in the Borden home and Lizzie's extreme distaste toward her stepmother, and her attempt to purchase poison the day before the murders. Several witnesses were called to testify about Lizzie's animosity towards Abby Borden. Her seamstress, Hannah Gifford, recalled Lizzie correcting her 6 months before the murders when she called Abby Lizzie's mother. "Don't say that to me," Lizzie had hissed. "She is a mean, good-for-nothing thing." Lizzie had told her that she had very little to do with Abby, although they occupied the same house. "I stay in my room most of the time. We don't eat with them if we can help it," Lizzie had said, referring to her and Emma eating their meals separately from her father and Abby. Lizzie's cousin, Anna Borden, who accompanied Lizzie during her grand tour of Europe in 1890, testified that Lizzie had repeatedly told her she did not wish to return to her unhappy home. Eli Bentz, the clerk at D.R. Smith's drugstore, was called to testify about Lizzie's attempts to purchase prussic acid the day before the murders. The defense tried to argue against this testimony, stating that the Bordens had not died of poisoning, so Bentz's testimony was irrelevant. However, the prosecutor explained that showing the defendant's state of mind was relevant as evidence of intent. Lizzie had attempted to purchase poison on Wednesday morning. In the evening, she'd visited Alice Russell and suggested her father was in imminent danger. She was planting seeds to point investigators in another direction, Moody told the court. This showed deliberation and premeditation of the crime committed just 1 day later. The judge allowed the witnesses regarding the attempted purchase of the poison to take the stand. However, Robinson entered so many objections, interrupting Moody so often during his questioning of the witness, that the point the DA was trying to make regarding premeditation was lost to the jury. But while the testimony may not have landed with the jury, it made quite an impression on the public. They learned about Lizzie's attempt to purchase poison the day before the murders for the very first time. As one reporter wrote, the prussic acid testimony, quote, may not prove important in the effect on the jury, but it has had the result of changing many of Miss Borden's friends from enthusiasm to thoughtfulness, end quote. Up until this point in the trial, Lizzie Borden still counted most of her friends, neighbors, and community members among her supporters. Now the tide was turning against her, but it appeared that the law, so far, had swung in her favor. Lizzie was feeling very hopeful about her chances for acquittal. On day 8 of the trial, the prosecution wrapped up its case. It suffered significant blows, including the court not allowing the jury to hear Lizzie Borden's inquest testimony. It was now the defense's turn to convince the jury that their client had been wrongly accused. Would they be up to the task? Lizzie Borden's life depended on it. That will do it for part 2 of the true tale of Lizzie Borden. Next week, we'll hear the defense's side of the story, learn the verdict, and see the aftermath of the trial of the century. You won't want to miss it, so make sure you're subscribed to Once Upon a Crime on your favorite podcast app. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. There you'll see full documentary-style videos of each new case we cover. Look for Once Upon a Crime podcast on YouTube, and please like, comment on, and share our videos. Become a Patreon member to listen to episodes ad-free and get access to them earlier than everyone else. You'll also get at least 3 bonus episodes a month and behind-the-scenes videos. Memberships start at just $5 a month. Go to patreon.com/onceuponacrime to find out more and join. Links to our YouTube channel, Patreon page, and sponsor discounts are always in the show notes. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia, and my researcher is Emma Battaglia. Until next time, be good to one another.